Noon, and thank you for joining us for the third session of Women Get the Vote. And Joe Britto will be doing our lecture as he always does, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, ma'am.
You're welcome.
Hello.
Good
So
afternoon.
we've had a couple of weeks, 3 weeks, hiatus. I don't want to start completely all over again, but I thought it would be helpful, you tell me, if not, I thought it would be helpful if we go back a little bit and take up where we left off. Any questions, comments from all the last time, anything you've been thinking about or read in the meantime?
No.
Okay. Okay. So I'm going to start with my favorite president in the world ever, Abraham Lincoln. And we mentioned, so let me go back a little bit and say, overarching this whole discussion about women getting the vote during this period of time, and we're really concentrating on from the 1840s, give or take, 1838, 1840, to 1900s, to the early 20th century, when they actually, when the vote actually comes into play, the law is passed, and the amendment is passed, and women get the vote. We talked about a number of very general things. And what we'll concentrate a little bit on today is one of those, which is the controversies and the intra-agency arguments and rivalries within this whole movement that was going on, number one. Number two, as I told you last time, and hopefully you remember, that a lot of the people from the 1840s on who were very, very much involved in the women's vote, anti-slavery, improving hospitals, improving mental institutions, the reformers, were all very much involved. They had their pet reform that they were most passionate about, but they were almost all very sympathetic to all the other reforms. So if you went to a meeting on women's rights, you might meet somebody, or you recognize people that you saw at the meetings that they had for better conditions in prisons and better conditions in insane asylums, and so you'd see the same kinds of reformers at all of these things. And like I say, most of these people were sympathetic to each other's cause. What we're going to talk about in about 10 or 15 minutes after we do this preamble is there started to be controversies within the women's movement, within the abolitionist movement, within some of these movements. Whereas the people who were very, very passionate about one thing wanted everybody else to wait until their thing was accomplished. And this caused a lot of controversy. In addition, there were controversies among and between various people, particularly we're interested in the women's movement. There were controversies within the women's movement. There were groups of women who really were, I don't think it's too far-flung to say they were enemies of a certain extent with each other. And that, plus the overarching thing about the fact that there were some women who were, a goodly amount of women, who were not in favor of women getting the vote, who were not in favor of women becoming more active in public life or even in the workplace. They thought that a woman's place was in the home. They thought that a woman's place was taking care of children and making a great home for her husband or other family members, etc., and that was her role. So that was a big deal and a big problem too. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to harken back, of course, to the reforms that were made in upstate New York at Seneca Falls, the big meeting at Seneca Falls, which at the time did not have the gravitas that it had later on. The very significant thing about Seneca Falls was that it made a lot of these issues public for the first time. and almost national. They became well known not only in the Northeast, in New York and New England, etc., but in the South, in the far West, places like that. And to bring this all together, and again, not to start at the very, very beginning, but to start at a very, very integral point, I wanted to talk about the Civil War. And not the war itself. That's another, we did that once before in a course that we had here. We'll probably do it again. But it needs to be, I think it needs to be covered. And it begins, and it's most significant, with our president, Abraham Lincoln, who, as soon as he was elected, perpetuated what would eventually become secession all through the South. There were southern states who, even when he was running for president, had threatened that if he were elected, if there was any chance of him getting elected, they would secede. And there's this great scene in a Civil War movie I saw where there's an argument among some Civil War generals, as a matter of fact. And one raises the issue of, oh yes, the Union, back in 1776, the states getting together to form the United States, that was a volunteer thing. In other words, we all agreed we were going to become a country, and we could leave anytime we wanted to. If we didn't like it, we can leave anytime we wanted to. And there were others who said, no, I don't know what you're talking about. This isn't like a gentleman's club. This is a little bit more significant. And you can't just up and leave whenever you want to. We have a constitution, we have this, we have that. So that was the constitutional issue. Of course, at the heart of everything, and it was very, very true from the beginning, but particularly true after the war started, let's say 1862, 1863, the war was all about slavery. It was all about African American slavery, which is another one of those great issues and great reform movements, abolition, which on the one hand had great allies among the women's movement, and then, as we'll see a little bit later, conflicted with the women's movement as to which took precedence, as to which was more important. So we'll talk about that too. So first, we'll start with Abraham Lincoln. So Abraham Lincoln gets elected president. The states begin to secede almost immediately. You can go to the next one, I think. Women take roles during the Civil War. Southern women, Northern women, African American women, other women. But remember that African American women, in the South anyway, the vast majority are slaves. And of all these groups that we're going to talk about, probably the worst condition, almost definitely the worst condition of any of the women, were women slaves, female slaves. Clara Barton was a nurse, really, and volunteered to work. A lot of women were usually not allowed to be on the battlefield, but some women would, it was very interesting. Some women would disguise themselves, literally disguise themselves as men, and actually fight on the battlefield. This is not the first time this has ever happened in history. Even when women were not part of the army, of the armed forces, which of course they are in a lot of countries now. But those days, it wouldn't be unusual for them to do that, disguise themselves, fight. A lot of times they would be camp followers. In other words, their husbands, their fathers, their brothers were in the army. They had either nowhere to go or they didn't want to leave, and so they followed them around on the battlefield. And once they were with the army in the battlefield, they usually acted as cooks, as cleaners, and even sometimes as prostitutes, and they would do other things alongside their men in the army. Clara Barton was, again, a nurse, a very, very famous nurse. Do you have a question?
Did she start something?
She started something. What did she start?
The Red Cross?
The American Red Cross.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you very much. Next, we talked about, now we hadn't mentioned this guy before, and he is, and I don't mean to be, right, I keep on walking, sorry. I don't mean to, I shouldn't say I don't mean to repeat myself, because I am going to repeat myself a lot as we go along. But he is probably one of the most significant figures, definitely one of the most significant figures of the 19th century in American history. And you know about Frederick Douglass. He was a slave. He basically freed himself from slavery. One of the things about slavery, one of the many things that we talk about slavery, was slaves being able to read and to be educated. That was usually against the laws of the particular farms, etc., to teach a slave how to read, but somebody taught him how to read. He became a noted speaker. He spoke to mixed crowds all over the United States, mostly in the North, of course. But he was a very, very significant figure in American history, period, in the anti-slavery movement. So we'll talk about him, because what's going to happen is very early on there's going to be somewhat of a rift between the women's movement and the abolition movement. Not completely, and not in every sense, but it gets very dicey in certain situations. He has a falling out with very prominent people in the women's movement, because it's all about what comes first. As far as he was concerned, voting for the black man was the most important thing. And he was very, very much in favor of the women's movement, but he said that has to come first. To some in the women's movement, they said no, this has to come first. Man, so much so that they would even tell black women, you don't want to support this. It's going to be bad for you if black men get the vote, but you don't. I mean, they would even get to that point. And some got very, very racist about some of the arguments they were making. Even very, very much respected women leaders at this time. We'll see Caddy Stanton, I'm thinking about in particular. But next we'll come to, I think it's them, okay. Another very, very significant aspect of the abolition movement in particular was religion. Religion, particularly Protestant Christianity. There were Catholic groups, Roman Catholic groups in the United States. There was a small Jewish community, a couple of small Jewish communities in the United States. But it is evangelical Protestants, and by evangelical Protestants, I mean more of a concentration on the Bible, on the New Testament, or the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament, but more of a concentration on the absolute interpretation of the words of the Bible. In other words, the Bible says these things not because it's like something, but that's exactly what they mean when they say it. So a very, very specific interpretation of the Bible. There happened in the United States, and I don't want to get into this, a couple of fabulous, fantastic books about looking at the United States and its development as if it were a development of, depending upon who you read, 7, 8, 9, 10 different areas of the United States, almost as if they're individual countries is a strong word, as if they're individual places all on their own without being part of the United States. So, for example, New England, the middle states in the United States, New York, New Jersey, a couple of other states, everybody had their own, the West, the South, different parts of the South. Everybody had their own shtick, if I may use that word, in that particular sense. And a great part of that development, no matter who you read or who interprets it, is Protestant evangelical Christianity. So, what happens? This great movement of the women's movement, this great movement of abolition, these great movements become hooked up with and connected to this movement within Protestant Christian churches. You have the phenomenon where this happens to be, if you notice, all the people are African American. African Americans form their own churches under the Great Awakening, and so-called white churches did the same. Now, I don't think it's far-fetched, and I think even leaders of black movements today would say that the influence of the black church, as it was called, was huge, absolutely huge, and huge from this time to the present, in terms of advocating for black people, in terms of some kind of connection with white people and black people, with the whole feeling that we're all God's children, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you've heard that argument. Most of us believe in that, basically in that argument. So the Great Awakening and the black church was very, very significant in the midst of all of these other reforms. So now, what do we have next? Okay. So now, the first great rift that occurs between these people. Cady Stanton was one of the probably 4 women that we talked about in the second session. 4 women who were, we would say, maybe the great leaders of the movement, and at least in terms of, and again, to distinguish it, the white movement of the women's movement. Cady Stanton was huge, at Seneca Falls, wrote the great document in Seneca Falls, et cetera, et cetera. And she was great friends with the next lady who we talk about, Susan B. Anthony. They became friends at Seneca Falls, and they were friends for like 60 years or something. But what happens is a rift develops between them and Frederick Douglass. Cady Stanton, it's not difficult to say, it's unfortunate to say, becomes very, very racist in her arguments for why the women's movement should take precedence over abolition, as we were talking about before. And there's a real break between her and Douglass. Douglass still maintains a relationship with Susan B. Anthony. And they will work together as it goes along. But that is, as it goes on, but that is probably the greatest rift, the greatest conflict that occurs at this time. I say the greatest conflict within the white women's movement. Because there's another underlying conflict which goes on for a long time between white women who are fighting for the vote and black women who are fighting for the vote. It comes to the point where in this conflict, if you go to the one before for a second, Cady Stanton actually warns black women within the women's movement, don't support abolition so much, because not abolition, don't support black men getting the vote, because if you do, it's going to be worse for you if black men get the vote. So this whole idea about black, white, and voting now comes down to women versus men in terms of voting. Black, white doesn't matter. It's not a good idea if men have all the power, whether you're white or black, which was her argument. You can go back to one more. What really made Douglass crazy is that those 2 women who I talked about, those 2 leaders, decided that they would get away from the Republican Party. Now, a minute to explain this because of our own times and what's going on in our own present time. The Republican Party that was founded in the 1850s is the Republican Party that we have today, the GOP, the Grand Old Party. The first candidate was that guy we talked about out west. The guy we talked about out west, Fremont, and his wife. You remember them? We talked about. I'm sorry?
I said that was a test?
That was a test. That was a quiz. You passed. You're all right. You're all right.
Yeah, but you have to go.
Right. The Fremonts. They were the first candidate. He was the first candidate in the GOP. They lost. He became very, very significant in the West. He'll come up again a little bit later on. But that's the GOP, and I want to emphasize it's the same GOP, the same Republican Party that we have today. Well, the same party. You might argue about some of those differences, but the same party. Caddy Stanton and a lot of the leaders in the women's movement, not a lot, a few significant leaders in the women's movement, leave the Republican Party and join the Democratic Party, which had always been at that time, so here's how things changed. The Democratic Party in the 1850s, 1860s was a Southern party for the most part. There was a Northern branch, but it was a Southern party. It was very pro-slavery, and it had people like this guy was a newspaper publisher, and he was a real racist. And the two women started to support him and made Douglas absolutely crazy, and that's basically why he had the break with Caddy Stanton in the first place. But this guy was a very influential character at that time. Okay, so that's number one controversy between the leaders of the reform movements that were very, very significant. Here's another ongoing controversy and conflict within the women's movement, and it's very, very racial. And it has to do with white women versus African American women versus, do you remember when we talked about going out west? See, I love this, and my students always in history classes used to love this. All this is going on at the same time, Professor Britto? Yes, everything is going on at the same time. That's what makes it a little bit dicey. But if you remember, back with the second session, I think, we talked about the opening of the West. We talked about, and I want to repeat this because it's very important. So all of this, again, happening around the same time. The invention of the telegraph, the invention of the railroad, which was an English invention that comes here, and the connection, therefore, because of the telegraph and the railroad, between the East and the West. Literally, things that used to take months to do, like in those days, before this, people, if they wanted to travel to the West Coast, would have to go around. There was no Panama Canal, so they had to go all the way around South America and come up this way to go by boat, or they had to cross the country. So if you remember, the wagon trains, and people going west in the wagon trains, and they did it by the thousands. But so many people died. It was such a ponderous trip. If you remember, again, reflective of our time in the pandemic, there was a cholera epidemic from Europe because of European immigration, and it had come over around the time that people were going to the West, and many people died on the way to the West. There was no vaccine, there were no conditions that were helpful, and people were dying. The telegraph, the railroad, later on the discovery of gold in California, thousands and thousands of people will be moving from the east to the west. When they moved to the east, from the east to the west, as you know, they met two particular groups of people: Native Americans on a wide scale, and Mexicans. I won't call them Mexican Americans yet, but they were Mexican Americans. If you remember, all of this territory was Mexico. From Texas up here and to the west, all of this, California, all the way up to Oregon. We had conflict with Great Britain about Oregon, so that was going on too. All of that was Mexico, the kingdom and then the Republic of Mexico. And there were a lot of Mexicans who lived in those regions. So all the people, all these Americans, all these white Americans and black Americans, why? Because a lot of the Southerners who were going west for their fortune brought their slaves with them. There were some free slaves, and we're going to be talking about them, free blacks, not free slaves, free blacks, who went west and actually made a good future for themselves out west. But basically, white people who were traveling west, and they would meet the Indians and the Mexicans. Let's talk about the Indians first, the Native Americans. So you can see on this map where the Native American places or where they were concentrated. You see here Comanche, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Yuma, Apache, Pima. Can you see some of these?
Yes.
Serrano, Yurok. All these are Native American tribes. The people traveling, thousands now, remember, who are traveling west are meeting these Native Americans. Most of the time, the meeting is not favorable. Sometimes it is. You have other phenomena too. There's rape that goes on between, because mostly there's white men who are traveling to the west. And you have instances of rape. You have instances of marriage, of actual marriage, between white people moving to the west, especially Mexican Americans. A very interesting phenomenon that occurs in European and American, North American traveling into the west was that there would be intermarriage between these people and the upper classes of the Native Americans and or the Mexican Americans. It happened in South America, it happened here on the way west. In order to establish, not only for financial reasons, but in order to establish some kind of property of value, and you're allowed to own property because these people had property, et cetera, you're not an unusual thing to try to intermarry with the ruling class. Essentially, that's what they were doing.
That was accepted
That was accepted by who?
by people in general?
By people in general, yes. By the ruling class, even of the Indians and the Mexican Americans, yes. And that was happening too. But also rape on a very, very large scale was happening. And we'll talk about immigration in general immigration in a minute or two. But that's the first thing. You can go to the next slide.
Oh, too far.
Eventually, there would be conflict, of course, between and among these people. And I'll show you first a battle that most of us know about, a battle between Native Americans and North Americans called the Battle of the Little Bighorn. This was a battle where actually a guy by the name of Custer, you know the story, Custer came by with his army and he was massacred by various Native American tribes who came together. You see a lot of them here. The Great Lodge, the Santee, the Hunkpapa, the Brule, Crazy Horse was one of the chiefs who was in charge of the army. Custer's army was wiped out. And because of that, revenge began to enter into the scene. This is all in the midst of this pilgrimage. Remember, like, we're talking about this, but try to focus on the fact that this is about North Americans moving to the West. This is about immigrants from Europe and from Asia, interestingly enough, coming to North America, which we're going to see in a minute or two, right? The slide's coming up. Okay. We're going to be talking about that. And this conflict between North American white people, for the most part, and Native Americans, Mexican Americans, etc. All this happening at the exact same time. Women, white women, black women, African women, Mexican women, Native American women, all in a hierarchy. All in a hierarchy. Okay. This young woman, Sarah Winnemucca, was a Native American who became a spokesperson. So you have a Native American woman achieving some kind of notoriety at this time, being very, very much involved in the women's movement from a Native American woman's stance, not particularly recognized by white women, not particularly either recognized by African American women. I mean, there's no contact that we know about. But she wrote, she preached preached is a bad word. She spoke in front of other groups, and she was a very, very significant advocate for Native American women at this time. And the reason why I mention her at all, to mention her at all, because going back to the first session we had, if you remember, when we went to school, we didn't hear about her. Did you ever hear about her before? Right. And we didn't. Nobody did. No matter you went to Harvard or you went to Brooklyn College, you didn't hear about her. But she was a very, very significant leader of a women's movement. Not in the same way, perhaps, that somebody would say Cady Stanton was, or anybody else, but she was a leader. So I mentioned her.
Joe, I have
Yes.
a question. How is she received by her tribe?
She was received, it's a good question, she was received relatively well by her tribe. There was a very significant thing about that, as I said before, that there was some intermarriage, actual intermarriage, between groups that were trying to get a better social position. And so that was acceptable amongst the tribe. I'm sure there were some leaders, I don't know specifically, I'm sure there were some leaders who didn't like what she was doing. But for the most part, she was generally received well by her tribe. She wasn't ostracized.
Okay,
People were usually proud of her
good,
for doing that kind
good,
of stuff.
good.
Yeah. The whites, the army gets back at the Native Americans at big time. I mean, I'm only going to mention one thing, but you know the story about the Native Americans. It's a sadder story. If you really get into it very significantly, it's a very sad story. And a similar thing happens. Army units are sent, U.S. Army units are sent to tribal locations where there are actually mostly women and children, but they are looking at this point to move the Native American tribes to reservations because they want the land that the Indians have. So they make these reservations in certain, not the best farmland, not the best land for mining or anything else, but just to get them out of the way. And these Indians resist, but again, this was a community that was mostly women and children, and the army attacks them and they really massacre everybody. So this was, on the one hand, a payback for Custer, but just in general, this was Indian policy in the United States at this point.
Wasn't there a movie? Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee?
There
Was that the movie? And a book and a movie, right?
Yeah.
Yes,
Kevin Costner or something.
correct. One of your favorites. You like Mr. Costner. But
Who
yes,
doesn't?
very much wounded. Huh?
Who
I said,
doesn't?
who doesn't?
Well, he doesn't do anything for me. But
Oh,
anyway, I do like his baseball movies.
Yes.
Gertrude Simmons Bonin, another Native American. I think she was Native American and European and white. And she spoke in front of,
Her name, yeah.
Yes,
Gertrude.
yes. Right, and she spoke in front of audiences. You see here the later writings of Gertrude Simmons, and then it has her native name.
Yeah.
Next to it, Zitkala Sa. So she was a significant figure at this time too. Okay,
that's a later date.
a later date.
Yeah.
This I'm trying to think of what.
Deep black.
So she was, Hunt Jackson was another, I think also mixed Native American lady, wrote this book, essentially the classic expose of the plight of the Native Americans. these were, and the point of pointing these out, the reason for pointing these out, is that this wasn't a one-sided thing. I mean, it was mostly a one-sided thing. It was the dominance of European Americans, white Americans in the West and everything. But there were very, very many educated speakers and people who were spokespersons, defenders of some of the ideas, some of the culture of these areas, who would speak up, who were recognized, who printed various books or exposés, and this is another lady, Helen Hunt Jackson.
Ready?
One of my favorites, because I get her magazine. There's a magazine now, Mother Jones, which I get. I don't know if any of you ever heard of it. It's, what's it like? You've seen it. You told me it would remind you of something. It's a news magazine. It's a news magazine, but it kind of is on the periphery of what you see in the mainline press. It's a little bit out there, which is one of the reasons why I like it. But she was a spokesperson for the women's movement, for equality among women. She got the name Mother Jones because she would take in, I won't say tenants because a lot of times they didn't have to pay for anything, but she would take people in and shelter them, et cetera, et cetera. She was a very significant spokesperson, female spokesperson in the West, too. And again, just because I really, really appreciate her magazine, I had to put her in there. Next, what we have. So this is another lady. Now, we come to the Mexican part of this women's movement. And Maria Amparo Ruiz de Burton, obviously married European American. And she also became a writer, a spokesperson for the rights of Mexican American women. This wasn't just, and this is the point of what we're talking about during this third session, this conflict between and among certain, even women. Remember that there were many women who were opposed to the women's movement. They didn't want any part of the women's movement. That's a whole other bag of women who supported the notion of women being in the household, taking care of the kids, making a good home for their husband, their father, their brothers, and having that subservient position. This is a position that comes to us from Europe, even, at this point. Now, there were parts of Europe and parts of Asia, actually, where that was not the case, or where the situation was worse for women than it was in the United States. So this is not just an North American thing. This is everywhere. But in terms of the Americas, North Americans dominated and were very racist and treated non-white women very harshly. If women were treated harshly, non-white women were treated more harshly, if you can believe it. Mary Ellen Pleasant, and I put her in here because when we talk about going out west and the difficult times that people had out west, Mary Pleasant was an African-American millionaire. She ran a boarding house. She ran a restaurant out west for years, 20, 25, 30 years, and catered to all the people that were coming out, mostly men, that were coming out for the gold rush, for just for to make their fortunes in the West. To try to buy more land, et cetera, et cetera. She was an entrepreneur who was able to be very, very successful. So there's success stories, not a lot, but there are success stories for these people too. Okay. And here we have, and I wanted to do this, the immigration to the United States in the 19th century. So you get an idea of who's coming and how many of them are coming. And if you notice, just to point it out, the Chinese, not too many in the 1850, 660, but look at 1860, and then 1870. Now, most of the Chinese who came from 1850 to 1860, so right before the Civil War, were women. And most Chinese women, for some reason, had to make their living as prostitutes. Couldn't work in restaurants, couldn't do much. The language was a big problem, but most of them had to try to make it in prostitution. The English, as you see, the French, I'm trying to think. German immigration to the United States from Germany was, well, it wasn't Germany until 1870. Germany was not a country till 1870. But from the German reaches of Europe, were mostly from southern Germany, middle and southern Germany, which happened to be Catholic Germany. Northern Germany was Protestant Germany. And most of them came from there. And the anti-Catholic feelings in the United States were very, very strong until almost the 1920s. But the Germans came, the Irish, as you know, and most of the Irish who came in the 1840s, after the 1840s, because of the potato famine in Ireland. Over 1 million Irish died in the potato famine, and over a million came to the United States and other places, Australia, different parts of the empire. The Italians, my people, came a little bit later. Most of them also from poorer areas in Italy, southern Italy, which is very poor, Sicily, you should excuse the expression. My mother's family is Sicilian, and they trace their heritage back to Adam and Eve, or the Sicilian equivalent of Adam and Eve. And Mexicans were here. It's interesting about talking about them as immigrants. Later on they would cross the border as they do now. But remember that many of them were here, and all of a sudden they were in Mexico, and all of a sudden they're in the United States. But they lived here anyway. So just an outlook, a general outlook of how much immigration was going on. And remember, women immigrants had a different life in some ways. Economics had a lot to do with it, and higher economic people coming from, and most immigrants were not wealthy, but of immigrants who came who were wealthy, they had a better time, an easier time than others. Later, or next week probably, when we talk about the early 20th century, my mother was a seamstress for, 30 years, 40 years. She was a seamstress for a very long time in New York, in Manhattan. And very many of these immigrant women in the United States, would stay in the United States, particularly in the north of the United States, would work in those industries, the garment industries. And we'll be talking about them a little bit later. So, wait a minute. So,
sorry.
I just have one little thing to say. Thank you very much.
Uh-oh, he's gonna deduct your pay now.
Good luck with that. But just to give you an idea, again, we talk about all this stuff happening at one time. We talk about all these conflicts happening at one time. This onrush of immigration was, in many ways, for the women's movement, and in terms of slavery, in a different way. We're not the influx. Well, the major part of these discussions that we're having is not about the Civil War or the results of the Civil War. Otherwise, I'd spend more time about it. But immigration, and most of this immigration came to the north. Some went to the south, but most came to the north. And that is really one of the reasons why by the middle to the end of the Civil War. So the Civil War was 1861 to 1865, the American Civil War. One could argue that the Civil War begins for a number of reasons. But by 1862-63, the Civil War is all about slavery. Civil War is all about slavery. Whatever the attitudes in the North were towards slaves, and they weren't always good either, the Civil War was all about slavery. This immigration hastens that to a certain extent, and that's all I'll say about it here. We'll talk about it some other time. But yes, you made changes now. Thank you. Ellen Watkins Harper, a very significant writer. She represents a very, very well-educated, free black woman who becomes very, very significant within not only anti-slavery, but the women's movement. She's probably as well known in either, I would say more in the women's movement. Writer, speaker, activist. We use that word a lot in our own time, but she was an activist at that time. Again, names, faces that we haven't seen in our education. I don't think any of us. But I'd like you to see these images, and this is obviously a photograph. It's not a drawing, it's a photograph. Okay. One of the men who supported this movement at the time was Sylvester Graham, and yes, if you, like I, love graham crackers, this is the guy. This is the guy who invented graham crackers. Similarly, like the guy who invented, like Kellogg's, remember Kellogg's? Who invented the cereal and stuff like that? These were people who remember that there's this overarching religious theme over everything. We talked about the Great Awakening, we talked about Protestant evangelicals. Again, it's a lot. We're talking about a lot. I get it. That's why I encourage you to ask questions. Encourage those of you at home who are watching this to send questions if you want to. We can continue this discussion. But a lot's going on. But people like him and Kellogg, they were very, very much involved in the belief that bad behavior, especially among men, had to do with our diet, that we ate too much meat, that because of that we were prone to sexual orientation, to think about sex all the time.
Back then they were thinking that?
Yeah.
Really?
Oh yeah. And so, in order to do something about this, and they opted for the religious theme, that this was bad behavior and the wrong way to act, et cetera, but they also believed, some also believed, that it had to do with things like diet and life choices and lack of exercise and all this other stuff. There were people who believed that. Graham, Kellogg, people like that said that if you keep away from that kind of diet, which enhances our libido. I don't know. I think that was the scientific argument, that if you ate these kinds of things, you'd be better off. So that's where graham cracker came. I don't know, but I just like graham crackers. Okay. So we come to the 19th century. We almost.
Yeah, the 1800s.
No, we almost.
Yes, you almost done.
Almost done, because I don't want to get too much into this. This is really the early 20th century, which I wanted to talk about. But excuse me?
That looks like my grandparents
Right,
building.
of course, because the tenement house, this kind of apartment, and this was something that was a necessity is the mother of invention. This was something that had to be arrived at because of all this immigration, because of all these people, because of the, again, movement breeds reasons, all this stuff has reasons why it happens. People are moving more into the city by the end of the 19th century, into the cities by the end of the 19th century. Economic reasons, security reasons, a lot of reasons. And so, with these immigrants coming in, with people who maybe don't have enough money to buy these big, a house by themselves with land, et cetera, what do? We built this kind of apartment house, which was an apartment house with 2 or 3 apartments per family, so you have 10 people living in 2 or 3 rooms. You know the expression, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater? Well, you know where that comes from, right? Okay. So what happened is that this was a necessary result. We were just talking about immigration by the thousands, people by the thousands coming to America, many of them living in the cities. This was a practical result of that immigration. So I'm going to end it here, probably.